Hey everyone. Before we begin today, just a quick note about my conversation with our guest. You'll hear me address him as Stephen, but he also goes by Siyuan Lu, which is how you'll find him listed at his university's website and in his publications. Alright, here's the show.
The Theater History Podcast is supported by HowlRound, a knowledge commons by and for the theater community. It's available on iTunes and howlround.com. Hi, and welcome to the Theater History Podcast. I'm Mike Leager. For many of us who perform in or teach theater, myself included, non-Western theatrical cultures are something of a blind spot. That's especially true when it comes to the more recent history of theater in a country like China. Luckily, today's guest, Dr. Stephen Lu, can help us learn more, as he's an expert in 20th century Chinese theater. An associate professor at the University of British Columbia, he's the editor of the Routledge Handbook of Asian Theater and incoming editor of Asian Theater Journal starting this fall. His monograph, Performing Hybridity in Colonial Modern China, examines the first form of modern Chinese theater, Wenmingxi, or civilized drama. Steve, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for doing this. It's great to be here with you.
The 20th century was this time of immense upheaval, drastic change in China. And in theater, a couple of these forms, I mentioned Wenmingxi, but also this form known as huaju emerge. What do these terms mean, huaju and Wenmingxi?
They are both forms of modern Chinese theater, basically Western-oriented spoken theater, spoken drama. The difference between the two is that Wenmingxi is the first form. Wenmingxi, literally translated as civilized drama, is the first form, which got its height about 1910s. It's the way we call it first form is that mostly it's hybrid form. It's a combination of Western spoken drama, traditional Chinese sing and dance drama, and some forms of Japanese theater. It's actually based on the first form of Japanese modern theater called Shinpa, which is new school drama. And that itself has a combination of Western theater and kabuki. And so they have kabuki forms of, for example, female impersonation using male actors and sometimes actresses to do female roles. There's some singing and kabuki style dancing, and there's some very stylized speech and movement patterns. And the shows themselves are very much melodrama and like kabuki, although they also have lots of quite interesting Western shows. But in Western shows, they actually tend to do melodrama again instead of realism, for example. So with the Chinese form, they inherited it. Some students were in Japan and then brought it back to China. And then in 1910s, it actually get a really big commercial boom in Shanghai. With thousands of practitioners for a little bit of time. And then, again, so there's tend to be a reliance on scenarios versus total scripts, right? A complete script. And then there is singing and dancing, and there is the structure tend to be the traditional Chinese narrative form of telling a story from beginning to the end, versus the Western late point of attack, 5 or 7 act structure, and then of course female impersonation together with the emerging actresses. And so that style kind of died down, although it just lingered on for a long time, but died down by the 1920s when what we call the new cultural movements in China started. The idea of everything traditional culture was bad for China, and that's why China went into trouble being defeated by Western power so many times. So they wanted to introduce something completely Western instead of Chinese theater. So that's where this huaju idea came from. The huaju literally means spoken drama. So the idea of totally rejecting traditional sing and dancing forms. So huaju from its beginning followed a very Western model, the idea of script-centric style, and then of course use of the director-centered rehearsal process, introduction of the design elements, the whole mise en scène is very much Western style. So that's basically the way modern Chinese theater has been. It's still called huaju. So that's about it.
This sounds like there's some kind of complicated stuff going on here. There's sort of an awkward relationship, perhaps, between traditional Chinese performance, what I think many of us who don't know much about it kind of sort of blanket refer to as Chinese opera.
Right.
So there's that kind of awkward, perhaps, relationship with traditional performance on the one hand, but then also this relationship with Western and Japanese influences. Did these two kind of contentious relationships bring out any tensions in huaju and in other modern forms of Chinese drama?
Yeah, actually what you described is actually a great way, actually. One very interesting way to look at modern Chinese theater. Actually, in a way, not just modern Chinese, but modern Asian theater as a whole. Kevin Wetmore and I actually did a couple of volumes about modern Asian theater. One is a history, one is a anthology of plays. So what we found actually is a interesting pattern. You can say 3 or 4 different quite distinct periods. The first one is what we call the hybrid period, like Wenmingxi, like the Japanese Shinpa, where modern Western and traditional theater were kind of hybrid put together. And then the second period is what some scholars would call the canonical period. It's basically totally going Western and saying everything indigenous is bad, and totally rejecting traditional performance forms. And then by the 1960s, 70s, 80s, depending on different country, there was a period of going back to traditional theater, saying, well, this form of total Western style just doesn't work for us. There's a joke that these are the unpopular theater versus the popular theater, the traditional form that we described, right? So in Japan, it took place in 1960s. That's where the Angora, the underground, the little theater movement came from, that brother Suzuki Tadashi, right? So those great directors came from that period. In China, the same idea. So we had that Wenmingxi as the hybrid. We have huaju as a canonical theater. And then since the 80s, there was the looking back again, using lots of traditional forms, a kind of hybrid coming back, or intercultural, if you like. So in terms of Chinese connection with Japan, it's kind of interesting in the sense that Japan modernized much faster than the rest of East Asia, right? So it became a kind of the West of the East in a way. China, lots of Chinese students went to Japan because at the time, Japanese language still used lots of Chinese words, lots of Chinese characters. So it's relatively easy for them to go there, to go to Japan to learn about the West. And this is what happened for theater. Still, nobody actually at the time went there to study theater per se in 1905, 06, 07, that period. But they started watching plays to learn Japanese, and then started thinking actually they could do it. It was actually 3 art students in the Tokyo Art College who started doing this the play, and so they started doing this and then brought it back to China. So Wenmingxi was definitely very closely, at least one style of Wenmingxi had close relationship to Japan. And then the second generation of Chinese students also were in Japan, and then brought back the beginning of huaju, following Japanese model, what they call shingeki, or just new drama, new theaters, that Japanese model equivalent of huaju. And then, of course, by the 1920s, Chinese students also went to the US and Europe, and so brought things back. So Japan did have a great influence. And actually, if you go back even move a little further, in the 1930s, the leftist world proletarian theater was part of, and in that, China also learned a lot from Japan. For example, the staging of the Royal China, the great Soviet play, was done on Broadway and was also done in Tokyo, in Tsukichi Little Theater. And the Chinese version in Shanghai actually borrowed from both of them. But China by the 1930s kind of overtook Japan in terms of modern theater. We have Cao Yu, for example, the great playwright, that got into a type of height that very few people in Asia at the time actually got achieved.
One of the we were talking about kind of intercultural exchanges here, and one of the more interesting sort of tidbits that you mentioned, writing in the Rutledge Handbook about sort of the early years of this new Chinese drama, is a play called Black Slaves Cry to Heaven. I think for American audiences in particular, that's got a particularly interesting history.
Right. Yes. I think you're referring to that. It was a Chinese adaptation of Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's actually quite interesting, and also actually is considered the first modern Chinese play, since it was staged in 1907 in Tokyo by a group of Chinese students who call themselves the Spring Willow Society. So that's quite interesting story. Again, pointing to the link to Japan, but also the reason why they started to do this play is because the Chinese translator of the novel, Lin Shu, actually tried in his preface to his translation to link the fate of black slaves to the fate of Chinese laborers in the U.S. So the idea is like a wake-up call for the Chinese nation to rise up, and so it's interesting. The play itself actually was a 5-act structure, so very much Western. And then, but it basically adapted the first several chapters, and the 17th chapter, George's escape. So it actually totally took out Uncle Tom's section. Instead, it had the rebellious black slaves, George and Eliza, right? It's talking about their escape from the slave estate, and then they're finally rising up actually at the mountain pass and beating back their pursuers and triumph. And so actually the play ended in great triumph. And so the use of these black slave stories as a wake-up call for the Chinese nationalism is actually huaju. Actually, modern Chinese theater, one of the biggest themes about modern Chinese theater is how it was used as a wake-up call for nationalism, for patriotism.
Yes, and this is, as I mentioned earlier, really two major events in the middle of the 20th century, the war with Japan, and then later on, the Communist Party's rise to power. How did these two major developments in Chinese history affect huaju? What sort of results did they have on the Chinese stage?
Yeah, Japan's invasion was, even before that, I mean, the war officially broke out in 1937. But as early as 1931, Japan already basically got Manchuria already. So it was quite interesting. In the 1920s, if we look at huaju, was mostly very diverse atmosphere. You get realism, you have anti-realism, all the great European styles, expressionism, symbolism, all that was in huaju. You can find all of them. But right at the beginning of 1930, Chinese theater most famously actually turned left. There was that they quote turned left. So the idea is that the leisure of the theater is gone, and we don't have that time anymore. So we need to be more consider what's going on in China and the fate of the nation. And so So that, and the Communist Party actually also conscientiously started organizing leftist writers and playwrights. In Shanghai, there was a leftist Dramatist Association in Shanghai. And so when the war started, even before the war, so these ideas, Raw China, for example, I mentioned, right, was staged in the early 30s. And then, so when the war started, they immediately staged several plays, and then they actually organized the artists, theater artists, into several propaganda groups. Went to the front and started all kinds of propaganda plays. For example, there was the very one of the famous ones is called "Lay Down Your Whip." It's a live newspaper play. And then they gradually moved with the nationalist government to the interior southwest, and then there they were quite a lively theater scene, and lots of new plays written at the time about the war efforts and all that. In terms of Communist Party, I said the Communist Party's connection with theater started quite early. So the general narrative about modern Chinese theater is, again, it has been since the 30s quite leftist and progressive. And then, of course, after 1949, there was a very conscientious effort about using theater to talk about the new nation, new efforts, and talk about the workers, peasants, and soldiers. The problem of that, of course, there were actually created some really interesting theater, but gradually, of course, became formulaic, right? The idea that you can only talk about progressive versus backward ideology in workers and peasants and soldiers became a problem. And so then, of course, Cultural Revolution. But then in the 1980s, actually, that's when the reintroduction of Western European anti-realistic modes. Brecht was a big event in China in the early 80s. His Galileo was actually a big event because the idea that the individuals don't have to shoulder the fate of the whole nation, and what's wrong with that was was a seismic event actually in China. And then, of course, we have playwrights like Gao Xingjian, who won Nobel Prize for literature in 2000. So he started little theater movement, experimental theater, and so it was, so it's quite interesting how to see how theater was linked to political events.
Now, this is sort of going on in Chinese theater while all these massive geopolitical events are occurring. There's also a major change in terms of who's on the Chinese stage, particularly women reappearing after, with some exceptions, about a 2-century absence.
Right. Yeah. They were actually banned from stage by the early Qing dynasty emperor. And so, yes, so they reappeared first on traditional stage by the end of the 19th century in Shanghai stages, and first in all women groups. And then when Mingxi came to Shanghai in around 1910, we started to have modern theater, Wenmingxi, all women theater groups. And at first, it was a great sensation, actually. And then there was also one mixed gender group company in Wenmingxi that started in 1913. But it's great to see the battle of the sexes, the genders, because there were otherwise quite progressive male actors who looked quite down upon of that mixed gender group as a kind of gimmick. There was personal animosity between them and the owner of that group. And then if you look at the biographies of these actresses, And the treatment of them is actually not at all unlike the first English actresses, right? During the Restoration period, right? Just that the idea that you put your body on the stage make you indecent, right? So that whole idea was very much there. So if you look at the background or the bios of these actresses, and some of them actually went so far as to mention that, well, actually her sister is a prostitute, but she doesn't look that good, and then so things. Yeah, I know. So and about personal lives and all that. But they gradually they learned, and some of them become um quite interesting, quite good actresses. But since she didn't last long, so that group of actresses, we don't hear about them as after the 1910s. Then the re-emergence of actresses in huaju has had some interesting stories. For example, the beginning of huaju in the 1920s again had men impersonating women on stage. And then about 1923, Hongshen is actually one of the greatest, supposed one of the three founding fathers of huaju. He studied theater actually with George Pierce Baker in Harvard in 1920, the 47 workshop. And then he went back to China and then became one of the key members of the Shanghai Stage Society. And then he wrote that because I read quite a few of Freud, and I always considered men performing women as perverse. And so he tried to persuade his comrades in the society. And then his idea of doing it was actually to stage two one-act plays side by side. The first one was performed by male and female as gender appropriate casting, and the second one was just by all male doing female impersonation. And so as a result, the first one that he directed was so well done, people really loved it. And then when the second one came up with all male casting, the audience started laughing at the actors at their very formulaic performance of femininity, right? So as a result, at least in his group, which was quite influential in Shanghai at the time, female impersonations stopped. And so gradually we had more actresses coming on stage and doing that. But it still took quite long because at the time, 20s, huaju was still a very amateur endeavor, and there were lots of school productions, and lots of the school was still segregated. And there was one story, for example, in Yanqing University in Beijing. In 1926, they tried to stage Mistress of the Inn by Godini. And then at the time, the school was very segregated. There was a male campus and female campus. And then the students wanted to do it with an actress, on the male campus. And the university eventually said no, they just couldn't do it. So yeah, but that play was staged in 1928 at Fudan University. The Hongshen directed them actually had a female student actually performing the role. So yeah, so it was a slow process, but eventually by the 30s, it was very common for actresses. And the female impersonation was virtually gone, at least on the more open universities that were not stages that were not segregated schools.
Now, we've mentioned a couple of major names, and we're covering a long period of time here, but we mentioned names like Cao Yu, author of plays such as Thunderstorm. You mentioned Gao Xingjian, who wrote plays such as The Other Shore and Bus Stop. Who are some of the other maybe major playwrights? If people are interested in this, they want to learn more, who are some other major names that they might want to learn more about?
It's a great question. First one, people probably should read about Bai Wei, who's actually not very much talked about, but is one of the earliest female playwrights. Her 1928 play called breaking out of Ghost Pagoda is actually talking about three women in their different stages of breaking out the so-called Ghost Pagoda, which is actually the family of a local tyrant man. And all three women actually in a way connected to him. One is his former mistress, but now coming back as a mature leader of the Women's Association at a time during the Civil War. And then she helps one of his present concubines actually to break out of the house and then go to the army to serve as a nurse for the progressive force at the time. And then there's also a daughter, a young woman who's actually a maid in this tyrant's house that he covets, but actually turned out to be the illegitimate daughter of the tyrant and the first woman, the oldest. And then, so in the end, there's a battle. There's actually gunfights and killing, and the young woman gets killed. But she, in the process, she also kills actually the tyrant. So again, about this three generations of women breaking out this post pagoda, and it's quite progressive, and it's quite very powerful play. And then we mentioned Cao Yu, who's a representative of the maturity of Chinese huaju in the 30s. If you want to find some representative figures in the 50s, you can probably talk about Lao She, who is quite famous for his two plays. The first was Dragon Beard Ditch in 1950. The second is the Tea House. It's probably one of the greatest modern Chinese theater plays or productions, actually, because the play was actually enhanced a great deal by the direction of Jiao Juyin, who is considered probably the greatest director of modern Chinese theater. Tea House actually uses a big Beijing tea house to talk about Chinese history, about three periods. The three acts is actually, the first one is 1898, right after the failure of constitutional reform. And then in the 1920s, about the Civil War period, about lots of warlords fighting with each other. And then the last act is about 1948, late 1940s, right before the communist takeover of Beijing. So talking about how life under the Republican government was still unbearable for the ordinary people. So it has a panorama of ordinary people's lives, and then they linked together in this tea house. This is a great play.
We mentioned Gao Xingjian, who's writing in the 1980s, 1990s. What are some other, in the last 30 years or so, more recent developments in Chinese theater to bring this up to the present day? I mean, what's kind of happening now or has been happening within recent memory?
Right. So after Gao Xingjian, there is also a great period of experimental theater in the 1990s, for example. There was some depression, and then some directors started experimenting. Meng Jinghui, for example, did several great plays. I Love XXX is actually a great, very interesting play that has every line in the play starts with I love. And then it's basically a chronicle of their generations growing up, their relations with People's Republic of China. He was born in 1965, so his generation, it's very dynamically staged, and it's really great. He's a director now at the Central Chinese Theater. And then in more later years, actually, huaju actually now is beginning to be part of the popular entertainment, which is never true 2 decades before the early 2000s. The sense is that with the rise of the Chinese middle class, the idea of the white collar theater, spoken drama became kind of possible. There's Agatha Christie very much in China. There's comedy and farce very much there. And then another element is that universities are again beginning to have a comprehensive university, because in China there used to be just Central Academy of Drama in Beijing and then Shanghai Theater Academy. Just those two. Now we're beginning to have theater departments in comprehensive universities, and some of them are becoming really good. For example, there's a 2009 play called Face for Mr. Chiang Kai-shek, was written by a student of Nanjing University and directed by a professor there. And that actually took a sensation throughout the China. It's kind of interesting. It starts with 3 professors during Cultural Revolution who reminisce about an event that happened in the right at the beginning of the Japanese War, and that when the then president Chiang Kai-shek invited them to go have dinner with him, and they debate whether they want to go, whether to give Chiang Kai-shek the face, right? The Chinese idea to give him the face, that to give him the courtesy of going there. And so the idea of contrasting Chinese intellectuals' power to entertain the idea of rejecting the president versus what happened to them during Cultural Revolution. So yeah, it was quite interesting play. So it toured the whole country, and people really loved it. So yeah, it's come a long way. Huaju traditional Chinese theater, and now it's kind of the national theatrical fabric together with traditional theater, and it's still quite lively.
For those of you who want to learn more about the history of modern Chinese theater, we'll include links to some of Stephen's more recent books in the show notes. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us and for a great conversation.
Thanks, Mike. This is great.
If you'd like to continue today's conversation, please visit howlround.com and follow HowlRound and @TheaterHistory on Twitter. A big thank you to the staff at HowlRound who make this show possible. Our theme music is The Black Crook Gallop, which comes to us courtesy of the New York Public Library Libretto Project and Adam Roberts. Thanks as well to Tip Kress, who designed our logo. And finally, thank you for listening.